On the 27th of March 2021, a long-lost Russian film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings was uploaded to YouTube, and because apparently I didn't have anything better to do, I watched the whole thing. You might have watched a few clips here and there, but trust me, if you haven't watched all of it, you do not understand how truly weird this movie is. And if you think that's weird, just wait until I show you Sauron and the giant eagle. Anyway, the whole thing is almost 2 hours long and you're not going to watch that, so as a public service to film YouTube, I've done a deep dive on this crazy, forgotten piece of film history. Like The Lord of the Rings itself, this video is presented in 3 parts. Part 1 looks at the historical context in which this film was made. Part 2 is my overarching comments on the film itself. Part 3 is the best one because it's just me showing you all of the crazy moments in the film. Now, before we begin, I should emphasize that this isn't a review. This film is truly unlike anything I have ever watched before, so I can't really pass a value judgment on whether it's good or not. I'm actually reminded of Roger Ebert's 0-star review of The Human Centipede. I am required to award stars to movies I review. This time, I refuse to do it. The star rating system is unsuited to this film. Is the movie good? Is it bad? Doesn't matter. It is what it is, and occupies a world where the stars don't shine. The Russian Lord of the Rings adaptation is, in every sense of the word, from another time. It could be from another universe. So if you're wondering whether it's good or bad, you're asking the wrong question. It is what it is. So let's put this film in context. Russian translations of the Lord of the Rings books didn't officially exist for much of the Soviet Union. The earliest attempts were heavily censored and mostly published without Tolkien's approval. See, Tolkien was very particular about how his work was translated. As a linguist, he put a huge amount of care and thought into every single name. He didn't just make them up. For example, Theoden comes from the Anglo-Saxon word Eodin, meaning lord, which in turn is related to an Old Norse word meaning leader of the people. Eomer's name is a hybrid of the Anglo-Saxon words Eo, meaning warhorse, and Mea, meaning famous. Other names like Aragorn are based on Tolkien's fictional languages like Sindarin. In his mythology, the Lord of the Rings books are presented as translations of the Red Book of Westmarch from Westeron into modern English, and many of the names within it are themselves translations from Middle-earth languages like Sindarin into English. Yeah, this is why it took him like 18 years to write the thing. What all of this means though is that he wasn't happy with foreign translators simply changing names to whatever they wanted. Now in Russia, the issue was not so much with translations as censorship by the Soviet Union. The first Russian edition of The Lord of the Rings was published in 1966, but it was heavily abridged to remove all of those pesky themes of anti-totalitarianism. In 1982, an abridged translation of The Fellowship of the Ring was published in Russian. This was essentially the only officially sanctioned translation of The Lord of the Rings available in Russian until the fall of the Soviet Union, although a translation of The Hobbit was officially published in 1976. Which brings us to the film adaptation. The title of this film is Kraniteli, which means keepers or guardians depending on the translation. It tells the story of the Fellowship of the Ring novel. It was directed by Natalia Serebrennikova, and it aired just once on the 13th of April 1991 on Leningrad TV. The reason it only aired once was probably because a few months later the Soviet Union sort of, well, Leningrad TV eventually became Channel 5. They're in the process of digitizing their 80-year-old archive, and during this process they found the old reels for Kraniteli in 2020, which until then was considered to be lost. According to the channel, digitizing this production was a long and painstaking process, and a tremendous amount of work was done to restore and improve the image quality. And wow, you can really see that. What makes Kraniteli interesting is the fact that it wasn't the first live-action adaptation of Tolkien produced in the Soviet Union. In 1985, Leningrad TV produced The Fabulous Journey of Mr. Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit, across the wildland, through the dark forest, beyond the misty mountains, there and back again. Catchy title. It's got a similar aesthetic and budget to Kraniteli, though the productions appear unrelated to each other. For example, Gandalf looks way cooler in The Hobbit. Kraniteli Gandalf just looks like Rasputin. Both The Hobbit and Cranatelli are considered television plays, and for the most part, Cranatelli very much looks and feels like a filmed stage show. The costumes are clearly leftovers from an old production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The sets are confined, and much of the acting is clearly theatrical, rather than cinematic. But Cranatelli complements the theatre sets with very rudimentary green screens for some of the more exotic locations like Moria, and intercuts scenes with some location filming. The film also uses what Channel 5 itself calls attempts at special effects. We'll look at those in part 3. So basically, if you've ever watched a classic episode of Doctor Who, you'll know what to expect from Cranatelli. Don't believe me? Well, this isn't a clip from a classic episode of Doctor Who. That's Soviet Saruman. Now, in a minute, I am going to go through all the weird and wonderful moments in the film, but before I do that, I want to make a few general observations. The first is that this is actually a pretty faithful adaptation of the Fellowship of the Ring. The major plot developments track pretty closely to those, at least in Book 1. Once they leave Rivendell, things kinda go off the rails a bit. The dialogue often matches the novel, though this could just be some creative liberty on the part of whoever did the YouTube subtitles. What surprised me was how faithful a lot of the characters were to the novel, particularly Gandalf, Aragorn, Boromir, and Sam. Each of these actors and the way they portrayed the characters were immediately recognizable and believable in those roles. Also, the fact that Pippin is always eating was quite a nice touch. Unfortunately, this wasn't universal. Frodo in particular was quite inconsistent, going back and forth between being this happy-go-lucky kid and other times doing things like trying to intimidate Aragorn. Another thing that struck me was the fact that the filmmakers clearly put some thought into making this accurate to the book, but were fantastically selective about it. For example, the hobbits all have furry feet like in the books, but the hairy feet go right up to their knees and make them look like these weird Wookiee hybrids. Then the hobbits are the same height as all of the human characters, so if you're going to focus on details like the feet in order to be faithful to the book, why would you ignore their other most defining characteristic? And before you write a comment about this scene with Tom Bombadil that you saw in every article written about this movie, this is the only time they use forced perspective, and in the dialogue the hobbits refer to him as a giant, implying that in fact Bombadil is abnormally large, not the hobbits being small. The film also frequently uses this weird fake form of soft focus. Now it's hard to tell if this is a result of the digital restoration process or part of the original film, but the end result is that it looks like someone has just smeared Vaseline all over the lens, which to be honest they may well have done. Also, I understand why the special effects are bad, but every time someone puts on the ring and disappears, they do so off screen like this. Having things disappear is one of the oldest and most straightforward visual effects you can do on film, so why did they never do it? There are so many really weird filmmaking decisions in this movie. Like, in almost every scene, the camera pans off, zooms into a candle, and fades out. Now, this is pretty universal cinematic language for a scene change, but most often, it just randomly happens in the middle of a scene, and then we return to it as if nothing happened. Similar to this problem is the narrator. This guy baffles me so much. He starts off narrating the film and delivering some exposition, but after about 10 minutes, we barely hear from him again for the rest of the film. Now, that would be fine, except for the fact that we continually cut back to him doing nothing except stare at the camera for a few seconds. So why is he even there in the first place? Finally, the music. The score was written by a Russian band called Aquarium, especially for the film, and it's just so at odds with what is on the screen that it deserves its own special mention. The film opens with a musical version of the poem about the Rings of Power. If the music itself wasn't enough, it's set to footage of the hobbits and the ringwraiths milling around in the snow. There's no narrative here, it just feels like those copyright-free music videos they have in karaoke bars. Some of the music is appropriate, like the Hobbit theme. But then they just seemingly play it whenever the hobbits are on screen, even if they're running away from the ringwraiths. Seriously, when I watch this, all I can see is this. But my favourite song is the Ringwraith theme. I just love the idea of the ring wraiths charging around Middle-earth, blasting this weird 80s synth rock music like they're in Blade Runner or something. It's just so jarring every time it comes on, and I just love it. Oh, speaking of things that are jarring every time they come on, there's also this. This happens quite a lot. But enough of this. You came here to see just how weird this movie is. So let's go through some of the highlights of the second weirdest Tolkien adaptation ever put to live action. What's the weirdest, you ask? Why, it's Mr. Spock singing about Bilbo Baggins, of course.
And everybody knows him, Bilbo Baggins.
So, in the order they appear, I present to you my personal list of highlights from Cranitaly, better known as the Russian Lord of the Rings. The fact that Lobelia Sackville Baggins not only appears in this film as a named character, but has more lines and screen time than Legolas and Gimli combined. Gandalf turning up at the party wearing an outfit that looks like it once belonged to Noel Fielding. The film showing us Gandalf's fireworks by lifting his cloak, then cutting to a static drawing of stars with some sound effects. Frodo casually whittling while asking Gandalf about Mordor. The fact that Mordor looks like this. The fact that the orcs look like this. When we have the flashback to Smeagol and Deagol, there's this hilarious shot of Deagol swimming, followed by him climbing out of the river completely dry. Deagol's hairdo. Smeagol turning into Gollum. Why is he gargling? Make it stop! Gandalf interrogating Gollum like he's a Russian gangster. The fact that they could only afford 3 horses, so to depict the 9 wraiths they just play back-to-back shots of the same 3 horses riding past the camera. Gandalf saying, and I'm not making this up, "Winter is coming" in Russian. The hobbits on the road dressed in colour-coordinated cloaks like they're the Power Rangers. The weird dream sequence in the Old Forest while they're trapped by Old Man Willow that goes on for 2 minutes. The music that accompanies Tom Bombadil's first appearance. The fact that it looks like the Bombadils are about to eat the hobbits. Bombadil copping a feel of Goldberry. The first terrifying appearance of the Barrow Right. The fact that part 1 ends with Frodo lost and alone being chased by the Barrow Right. Talk about a cliffhanger. The fact that part 2 begins with the narrator silently staring at the camera rather than recapping what happened in part 1. The fact that the hobbits lying in the Barrow Down with a sword on their throats is an iconic scene from the book that's not in any other film adaptation. Can I just briefly interrupt the run through of the film to say that the decision to take the Old Forest, Bombadil and the Barrow Downs out of the Jackson film was completely justified. They add nothing to the story, slow the whole thing down. This whole 20-minute sequence in Cranitaly clearly shows how inconsequential they are to the wider plot. Go ahead and leave an angry comment about how much you like Tom Bombadil. You know I'm right and I will die on this hill. Anyway, back to the highlights of the film. The filmmakers giving Strider a scar to make him look extra badass. A wild barleyman appears.
Mr.
The way everyone pronounces Aragorn.
По-настоящему Aragorn. Aragorn.
The Ringwraiths attacking Frodo, and no one else is to be seen, including Aragorn, who in the scene immediately beforehand said he would protect Frodo. The fact that the Ringwraiths stab Frodo, then just leave and go back to Mordor for no reason. Frodo saying Gandalf.
Gandalf.
The court jesters at the Council of Elrond. Matt Damon as Elrond. The tiny orc dance while Saruman gives his evil speech. Gandalf riding the giant eagle to escape. This shot of the Fellowship all together. Is Gandalf carrying Gimli like a baby? Oh no, wait, no, that's not Gimli. They're just using Gimli as a table. Is that racist? I feel like that's racist. The Fellowship getting attacked by warg puppets. The Fellowship running away from the wargs against a stationary green screen backdrop. When they get to Moria, Frodo immediately charges forward for no reason, yelling, "For the Shire!" and falls down a hole, and we spend the next 3 minutes rescuing him. Aragorn on the rope rescuing Frodo with these random shots of Legolas reacting to nothing. Also, did I mention that Legolas is played by a woman in this film? Any reaction shot with Merry. The 10 seconds of the orc ambush and Aragorn's reaction basically sums up this entire movie. How Boromir fighting looks and sounds like a Mortal Kombat ripoff. Legolas's sword being made of tinfoil, Aragorn crossing the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Sorry, there's no Balrog in this version. Everyone else crossing the bridge, including Gandalf, even though a few minutes earlier Gandalf got overwhelmed by orcs and died. In the shot after we just saw Gandalf cross the bridge, Aragorn says that Gandalf died. The dancing elves in Lothlorien, Pippin being distracted by this bell like he's a cat. This terrible miniature used to establish Galadhrim's city.
It's only a model. Shh.
Galadriel, evil Galadriel. And finally, the moment you have all been waiting for. Frodo looks into the water, which for some reason is red, and sees Sauron. Are you ready? Are you ready for Soviet Sauron? Whatever it is you're imagining, I guarantee you it's not this. Okay, here he is.
Это я, черный властелин Саурон. Я слежу за вами. Отдай мне кольцо Фродо. Брось его в чашу. Все равно оно не поможет вам.
Honestly, I have no words. This happens almost right before the end of the film. All that remains is Boromir confronting Frodo and trying to take the ring, which is a pretty boring climax to be honest. Then Frodo resolving to leave the Fellowship behind. Sam catches him and, like in the book, he sticks with his Mr. Frodo. The film ends with them riding off into the proverbial sunset, holding hands. Even in Soviet Russia, the friendship between Frodo and Sam is unbreakable. Thank you for watching, guys. You can see me talk more about the Lord of the Rings here, and if you enjoyed this video then please consider clicking here to subscribe. Namaste.